Also, while following this campaign, I've actually found better information and discussion of the issues on newer media sources such as blogs and Facebook. Meanwhile, I find the mainstream media discussions of the election to be lacking. How do you plan to use new media sources to interact with your constituents?
Well, I don't think one could reasonably expect to run a political office, certainly not a U.S. Senate office, without relying extensively on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and other social network uh, channels of communication. Um, so I intend to use them a lot. I also intend to utilize virtual town halls and things like that to communicate with constituents. Because again, the fact that these technologies exist means that we have to use them, we should use them.
Much has been said of your involvement with energy solutions, and many are trying to represent this involvement as a liability for you. I just want to know what experience you've gained from working with this company that you think would be an asset for the voters of Utah.
First of all, it's significant that they retained my law firm to retain my services, to represent them in a case in which their rights were violated by an overreaching government. Now, in this case, it was a state, or rather a group of states, that had overstepped state authority under the Constitution. Most of the time, what the Constitution does is limit federal power in order to preserve state power. In this instance, the Constitution limits state power and says that the federal government is in charge of certain things. But the point is, this is yet another example of where I have represented a client in order to limit the power of a government entity of one sort or another, where that government entity has overstepped its boundaries under the Constitution. That's where my focus will be as a U.S. Senator, is limiting government, not expanding it, and being faithful to the text of the Constitution, even where that might not be politically popular. Interestingly enough, that case in which I represented that company had nothing to do with whether or not it's a good idea to dispose of Class A material in Utah. It has nothing to do with whether or not it's a good idea to import foreign material for disposal in Utah. It had only to do with which government entity gets to regulate that, which government entity gets to decide whether or not such material is imported. The state, or a group of states, or the federal government. I believe it was the federal government. It's fairly clear to me, under the law and under the Constitution, that that's the right answer. It has nothing to do with whether or not it's a good idea to bring it in. That's a completely different question that wasn't presented in that case.
Your opponent has tried to represent your involvement with nuclear waste in Utah as an issue where you have been inconsistent in your position. On one hand, you're fighting for the interests of the state. On the other hand, you're fighting against the interests of the state and in favor of the rights of an individual company. It appears that your opponent is trying to say that because of this inconsistency, you won't be the staunch advocate for states' rights, which is an important issue that is mobilizing the conservative movement. I look at a state like California and I come away thinking that a fierce advocacy for states' rights isn't always going to guarantee a good outcome. At what point do you draw the line between states' rights and individual rights?
I draw the line the same place where the Constitution draws it, because that's what guides me. The Constitution primarily limits federal power, but in some instances, again, it limits state power, and that's where I decide where to draw the line, is where the Constitution draws it. In other words, Article 1, Section 8 grants certain powers to the federal government. Article 1, Section 10 denies certain powers, including the power to make decisions on things like imports and exports, to the states. So that's where you draw the line. Is this, under the Constitution, an appropriate power for the state government to exercise or for the federal government? That's how you draw the line. That balance was struck 223 years ago, and that's the same balance that's in effect today.
Most voters who are following this election know about your involvement with Energy Solutions and possibly your work with 1-800-CONTACTS, because these are cases where the media has been able to drum up enough controversy to run a story or two. You say that you've been spending your professional life fighting against the growth of government. Can you provide some other specific examples of cases that you've been involved in where you were directly fighting the growth of government?
Sure. About 10 years ago, I was involved in a case that was before the U.S. Supreme Court We represented Marathon Oil Company and ExxonMobil against the U.S. government in an instance in which the federal government had basically breached its contract with these oil companies. It had sold oil leases to them, and then through an act of Congress had basically made it impossible for these companies to ever drill for oil on those leases. And so our clients sued the federal government trying to get restitution against the federal government because it had paid $156 million for these leases, but those leases had been rendered valueless by the federal government's own actions. The Supreme Court ruled in our favor, and we won $156 million for our clients. In another case, I represented the state of Utah against the U.S. Census Bureau, which had violated both the Constitution and Section 195 of the Census Act, 13 U.S.C. Section 195, in using a statistical sampling mechanism in conducting the 2000 census. More recently, I've mentioned the Energy Solutions case. That was where a multi-state compact had overstepped its boundaries under the U.S. Constitution. There was another instance, another set of cases, two cases in which I was involved with the federal government's decision to cancel 77 oil and gas leases in violation of federal law in the Uinta Basin. I'm sure I could think of others, but those are
No, that's
some
good.
cases
It's
that come
good
to
to know
mind.
some other ones, since they don't seem, the media doesn't seem too interested in digging into what you have done. That I think has been good work.